Look, thanks again, Alan, for joining us, and really appreciate the effort you put in, and hand over to you now to talk to us about building inclusive value chains for smallholders.
Sure. Thanks, Rod. I'm going to talk kind of from a very top level perspective on the topic. So I wanted to kind of really motivate why we think finance is important. And this is based on a book chapter that I've just written with Yo Swinen, who is the current Director General of IFPRI. I'm still waiting for Yo to actually have give me some comments on the book chapter, so you might be able to get in before the second author. And then with Kate Ambler, and this is also building on work that I'm doing with Kate Ambler and Sylvan Herskowitz, and some others, of course, as well. Let's see if I can change to the first slide. So I want to really, there are three major global concerns in agriculture right now. So I want to ask three questions to start, and these are really big picture questions. And one is, will there be enough food to feed the world in 2050? The second question is, can the agricultural sector produce more but produce less resource intensively? So if we can produce enough food by 2050, can we do it using less resources? And a third question that's being asked of the agricultural sector right now, and this is globally, is can the agricultural sector produce more nutrient-dense foods, so more fruits, more vegetables, more animal source foods, at least in certain countries, not maybe in Australia or the US, but in other countries, people need to eat more, or certain people need to eat more animal source foods to nudge people towards healthier diets from the grain-based diet we see in developing countries fairly regularly. So all of these questions, the answers to all these questions relate to I argue, investment. To feed the world by 2050, we need investment in higher yielding varieties of crops, not just grains, but other crops as well. Other crops, we need other new livestock varieties as well. We need investments in new technologies to help boost usable yields as well, fertilizers, post-harvest loss abatement strategies, etc. To produce more but less resource intensively, we need investments in climate smart agriculture, investments in disseminating new techniques that reduce soil erosion and water use. And to produce for consumption more nutrient dense food, we need more investments in cold chain and other farm to table technologies. So how do we solve these major global agricultural concerns in the medium term? Through investment is my answer. Okay, so how do you get investment? Well, to invest, you need money, right? That's sort of the key. But investment in agriculture lags other sectors. So I'm showing you a graph of the most recent data that I could find from, I think this is an amalgamation between the FAO stat and the World Development Indicators. But if you see, if we assume that the share of credit going to agriculture should be the same as the share of GDP coming from agriculture, what we see is a lot of countries down below the 50-50 line, the 1-to-1 line, and very few countries actually are above the 1-to-1 line. Actually, Australia, you can clearly see Australia on the diagram there. Just about 6% of credit going to agriculture and about 4% of GDP, but lots of countries are clear below the line, meaning that agriculture is receiving less credit than the share of GDP would suggest that it should, and in some countries it's substantially less. And another point to make is that smallholders remain really important for agricultural production. The best estimate that I could find is that there are about roughly 500 million farms worldwide, below 2 hectares in size, and about 427 million of those are family farms. Those farms combine to produce about 30% of all the food in the world. So if we want to meet these global goals that I put up on my first slide, feeding the world less resource intensively, and feeding the world better, smallholder inclusion is a must. It has to happen, or you're basically just you're tying your hands behind your back before you get started. Okay, so let's put these thoughts together a little bit. To make private investments that are needed in agriculture, it's necessary to direct more formal, and let's call it private finance to agriculture, okay? But it's important to also to make sure that smallholders are a target of at least a portion of those that investment or that credit that needs to take place. And that's tricky because smallholders, we know that smallholders are neglected by finance for well-known reasons. These have been in the literature for years and years and years. These relate to high transaction costs. What do I mean by high transaction costs? Well, if you're a banker, would you rather make loans to 1,000 farmers that each have a hectare, or to one farmer who has 1,000 hectares? It's pretty, when you think about it that way, it makes sense. Of course, I just want to make one loan to the guy who has 1,000 hectares, because it's much easier to make one loan than 1,000 loans. A second problem, and we'll come back to this, is that smallholders often lack collateral, or almost always lack good collateral for their loans. So as a result, not only is it more expensive to make loans to farmers, but then they don't have collateral to put up for those loans. And then third, there's a lack of observability of their effort towards actually producing. So if banks can't see that the farmers are making efforts, then they can't see that people might not just be shirking on their loans. Is a long-term concern about making loans to smallholders, and this is given as a reason that finance neglects smallholders. So, and these problems may even be compounded amongst female smallholders, and migration in a lot of countries in the world has been making female smallholder management more common, at least prior to COVID. I'm thinking of countries like Nepal, where I've done surveys where up to 40 to 45% of farms now are managed by women. So we see there's a gender aspect, but then there are also these issues that make it difficult for finance to lend to smallholders. So why now? Why should we worry about this problem now? Well, one reason is that technology is changing the world very quickly right now. After all, I'm not just a creepy guy, I hope, giving a webinar in my basement at 11 o'clock at night. Instead, I'm able to talk to people all over the world, presumably, or at least in Asia. I presume people in Europe are not really online for this right now. Technology is changing the world really quickly right now. There are lots of opportunities, and some of these opportunities relate to mobile money, which can ease payments, credit, financial technologies can lower the transaction costs of giving these loans. Blockchain is out there and can track money or goods through supply chains or value chains. Satellite data is starting to be used for measurement. There are really cool peer-to-peer lending models that are coming about. Satellite data can be used in insurance. So there are lots of different ways that technology is beginning to change transaction costs in the agricultural space, and that's an important point related to a reason why now. Why should we think that we can start to solve these problems differently now? And a last point is that there's tons of opportunity out there. This graph shows the value of fruit and vegetable exports from selected regions between 2000 and 2017, starting at 100 for in 2000. So I've normalized all of the values of fruit and vegetable exports to 100 in 2000. And what we see is that in Africa, in so Africa is actually growing the fastest. It's grown by, fruit and vegetable exports from Africa have grown by 350% Well, they've grown 4.5 times since 2000. Same thing for Southeast Asia. South Asia has grown a bit slower, but still grown more than tripled. And Central America, where we get our fruits and vegetables here in the U.S. in the winter, has also grown by almost 300%. So Central America is the laggard here, and it's grown by 300%. So we see really big opportunities, at least in export markets, from all sorts of regions, and there's no reason that smallholders shouldn't be able to participate as a result. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears. That's my motivation. I want to switch gears a little bit to talk about whether the value chain can be used to increase finance, and I want to talk now, in the rest of my talk, I want to talk a bit about ways that the value chain can be used, but then also the effectively the conditions that are needed to make the value chain work to increase finance for smallholders. So this is a stylized depiction of a value chain. Smallholders need production inputs. They need seeds, fertilizer, machinery potentially, herbicides, pesticides, labor, and then they sell, let's say, to an off-taker or an aggregator. They sell to someone. It could be that they sell directly to the processor, and I'm going to kind of mix those two, that language a little bit. A processor might store the food, they may process it, then they send it out to distribute it and transport it. The processing could be something as simple as milling. It could be making Twinkies, although that takes a lot of non-food as well. I guess everybody knows who Tom Reardon is. He likes to talk about Pop-Tarts in this context. They don't have a lot of food in them either. But then that processing leads to distribution and transport. That gets to food retail, who might label it, and then it finally gets to the consumer. Some value chains are shorter. A lot of these steps in between the producer and the consumer might get limited, but I want to show that there are 3 points where we might need finance. And one is that, let's start from the food storage and processor, and my arrow on the left. They may require specific quality of foods or specific quality of foods to do that processing, right? And they may also require finance. They may not. They may not. If there's a layer between the processor and the smallholder, the off-taker or the aggregator, even in grain, these guys may require short-term finance. So I've talked to people who work in value chains. I'm particularly thinking about conversations I had around a failed mobile money project 7 years ago in Mozambique, where we were talking to guys, and they were talking about the stacks of cash that they'd take out into the field, and they just need them for 2 weeks to go buy up all the maize in specific areas. And we were talking about how great it would be if they didn't have to take these stacks of cash with them because of all the risk involved, but then somebody had to have that cash to be able to get it out to the smallholders to buy the maize in the first place. So those off-takers, you might require some really short-term, like 2-week, 3-week loans, so that people can have the money to get to the smallholders for those crops. Smallholders may need finance in the first place for those quality inputs to get the food, to be able to produce the food that the processors actually want. So there are 3 pieces here where we might see a need for finance pinpointed within the agricultural sector. And I want to focus on these types of transactions. Okay, and one of the reasons I want to focus on those is I want to think about the 4 ways, actually kind of 3.5 ways, and using the value chain as a lever is really part of one of the 3 ways to make these transactions occur. If I was clever, I would have had these points move in on the slides, but they're all just here. So apologies for that. So the first way that these transactions can occur is through a spot market, right? So the smallholder could just sell to any off-taker. But if they're selling to any off-taker, then essentially their incentives for producing a specific type of quality are reduced, right? If they're just selling to any off-taker who's then selling to some processor or aggregator down the line or downstream, the smallholder is not really getting much of a signal anymore for their quality. So there's really not much of a role, a direct role for finance in a spot market type relationship. And quite honestly, a lot of grain is sold on spot markets. A second type of relationship you can have is a contractual relationship, and that contractual relationship can be formal. So there can be a formal contract between, say, the farmer and a specific off-taker, or a farmer and a specific processor, but it could also just be informal, that the farmer knows a specific processor or off-taker and always sells to that person. Finance can, once you have that contractual relationship, whether it's a formal relationship with a formal contract or an informal contract, that meaning like a repeated interaction that happens on an annual basis or a daily or weekly basis, in the case of something like milk, finance can flow in that relationship from the processor to the farmer, so they can afford, or the off-taker, so that the farmer can afford to buy the inputs needed to meet or attain any quality goals in that relationship. It could be that the farmer goes to a third party, which is the bank, and the bank then goes and gives, or an MFI, a microfinance institute, who gives money to a farmer who really wants to upgrade their production to get into a line. But oftentimes it happens through contractual relationships. There are two types of contracts that could happen there. A triangular relationship or third-party involvement occurs when finance flows to a processor to ensure their production. So that food storage and processing type of link in my value chain, who then contracts with farmers to produce. So the production, then there's a third loan that takes place, or another flow of finance that takes place between the processor and the farmer. And one might think of that triangular relationship as being too complicated. So I want to talk a bit more about why does that occur relative to vertical integration. So what happens with vertical integration? Some company says, oh man, some processing company says, it's just too complicated for me to give all these smallholders a bunch of finance. What I'm going to do is just buy up the land from the smallholder and eat up that whole piece of the value chain. Okay, so they undertake both the processing and they undertake the production and the processing, and they just take it all in-house. Okay, so that's where the processor, maybe they rent the land from the smallholder and eat it that way. And you might see this in sugarcane, especially in parts of Africa, where that vertical integration takes place. And then they might rent out little pieces for people to produce on. Okay, so what determines when these different contractual relationships take place was a question that I spent a lot of time in this basement trying to solve, actually, when we were taking this step back. And I really wanted to give you a 2x2 matrix where I could like make a nice pretty diagram and tell you, oh, this is, in this quadrant this happens, and in this quadrant this happens. And it turns out that it's just, there aren't two dimensions to this problem. And so it's not easy to come up with a nice 2x2 matrix. But in order of importance, these are the factors that make agricultural finance possible within a value chain, and even agricultural value chain finance, or AVCF, if you will. So the first and most important factor is what I'm going to call here the value difference, but if you had a better term for me, that would be great. And what I mean by that is that let's consider that the farmer or the smallholder is doing some current activity that produces some production value, some amount of production value. And they could consider a new activity that increases the production value of their land. Okay? And that's what the finance would require. Well, the difference in the new and the old value needs to be large enough so that all involved parties have some incentive to participate. In other words, there has to be enough room between the old value and the new value so that there's a piece for the farmer, a piece for the processor, and a piece for the financier. If there isn't, then there's not going to be an agricultural value chain finance relationship. And if the value, if there's a very small difference in value, there may not be anything but a spot market. And so that's a really crucial point. Secondly, risk becomes very important as well. And we know that all agricultural production is risky, but there are specific risks that relate to particularly fruit, vegetable, crops, animal source foods that have to do with spoilage, timing, and so there's just a lot more risks in those types of products. When you have more risk, when there's more aggregate risk, pricing risk can be there too. There's more incentive to spread out that risk among more value chain actors. So if the farmer doesn't have to take on all that risk, that helps them. But the fact that there is all of this risk also helps the aggregator want to spread some of that out to others as well. Credit constraints are a third point. We can basically just assume that smallholders are credit constrained. They may be able to find informal sources of credit, but at market interest rates, there's a credit constraint basically almost anywhere in the world. The trick is whether aggregators and processors or even potential financiers are also credit constrained. If they are, there becomes more incentive for agricultural value chain finance. Just to give an example, I was talking with, I don't know if Tom Moyes has given a talk yet, but I was talking to Tom a few weeks ago, and we were talking about MFIs we were talking about potential projects in Myanmar, and he describes all MFIs in Myanmar as being credit constrained. So if you could come in with a bunch of money for MFIs in Myanmar, you could potentially see some more of these types of linkages. But there you might need like a really complicated agricultural value chain finance to make it work with one of those MFIs. Okay, a fourth point is payoff timing. So longer term investments, think of tree crops or cows, they need more complex sources of finance. Tree crops in particular, if you think about trying to do some climate smart agricultural projects in, say, Indonesia, where you wanted to replace palm oil trees with higher yielding palm oil trees, people are going to have to go without the income from their palm for not just 2 years, 3 years. So they're going to need a pretty big loan to get them through that period of time to make sure they have base consumption, et cetera. And so those longer term investments can also need more complex sources of finance to get them to work. Coffee would be a similar type of investment to upgrade coffee in a place like Vietnam. Competition, the level of competition is crucial actually as well. If you have monopoly power at any point in this value chain, that can affect the payoffs to these new activities and the pieces that I was talking about, and then their probability of success. So if there's too much effect, there's not going to be competition we can assume there's competition among smallholders, so they're price takers. But if there are, if the processor or the financer the finance company is a monopolist or close to it, they may be able to just eat up the surplus, and that might dissuade farmers from participating unless there's some sort of regulation. And finally, institutional factors are really crucial as well. We can think of institutional factors as land or property rights, contract enforcement in terms of implicit or explicit enforcement, financial sector regulation, institutional relationships between finance and agriculture can also matter. All right, Rod, I'm realizing I'm talking too much, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. I don't have that many slides left, actually.
No, it's fine, Alan. You just keep going. It's going at a nice pace.
All right, super. All right, great. Conditions. So what gets you agricultural value chain finance? Well, one, you need a large enough value add for farmers, processors, and financial institutions to all potentially gain from this contracting with one another. Two, you need the incentives to spread out risks. So you're going to be much better off in most contexts with a fruit or vegetable product than rice, for instance. Most contexts. I'll get back to that in a second. You need limited market power. So if one of these actors has too much market power, it can reduce the incentives for others to participate. And you need a favorable institutional framework. You need, actually, one thing that was a big realization for me was that a lot of the value chain finance relationships we see in the world have come up in places where land rights are not perfect. So vertical integration is not favored. You saw a lot of it take place in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe right after the Soviet Union collapsed. You saw a lot of agricultural value chain finance come about, and part of that was that there were these hazy land rights, and nobody knew who could buy up what, and nobody wanted to take risks of buying land that they couldn't, they didn't know they'd own. So they went into these value chain finance types of relationships instead. And then you need enough linkage between the agriculture and the financial sector to make such contracts possible. What I mean by that is that if the financial sector truly knows nothing about agriculture, that's going to be a big constraint against getting things to work. Not as crucial, but helpful are credit constraints in those long-term investments. So credit constraints meaning credit constraints among processors. Nobody, if I can borrow money to make a big investment, that's always better than, not always better, but it's often better than making the investment myself. I didn't buy this basement. The bank helped me buy this basement, or a bank helped me buy this basement. So conditions for agricultural value chains in selected Asian countries. So just thinking about this, I wanted to give you some examples. We've been working on agricultural value chain finance policy reports for Myanmar and Vietnam, and those are done, and we're still working on Indonesia through an ACIR funded project that I'm leading. And the value proposition is potential even in Myanmar for grains because the yield gap is so big. So for corn and for rice, you could imagine it being there in Myanmar just because there is, what I mean by the yield gap is the gap between the actual yields and potential yields on land. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's profitable to produce at what would be the potential yields, but it does mean that there is potential for that value proposition to be met. But that value proposition is going to be much more concentrated in fruits, vegetables, tree crops, livestock, or other cash crops in Vietnam and in Indonesia. We're also finding that in all three countries, there are challenges with what I might call challenges with banking regulation. There are fixed interest rates for agricultural or specific types of loans. There are limits on size of loans that lack collateral, and some other types of limiting regulations. Within banks in Myanmar, there's also essentially a capacity constraint, meaning that there aren't a lot of people who know agriculture very well, and there's efforts being made to build that human capital up to realize that there are these opportunities. There's also market power within the formal financial sector. There's one main, often actually in both Vietnam and Indonesia, state-owned bank conducting most of the finance. In Myanmar, there's a Myanmar Agricultural Development Bank that is being reformed at the moment, but also has quite a bit of market power. And that said, land rights institutions are pretty helpful in all the countries, in that it's difficult to aggregate land and vertically integrate yourself. I want to say last thing about collateral, because that's kind of been missing from my talk at this point. There are a bunch of ideas going out there about alternatives to collateral, and these are potentially helpful in increasing access to finance. Warehouse receipts are one. That's a warehouse in Senegal, actually, in the picture there. And the idea is that the grain in your warehouse can be kept in bags there. One even says quality product of Vietnam on it, even though I took that picture in rural Senegal. Idea is that the grain in the warehouse can act as collateral for loans, or even in the history of you taking your grain to warehouses. If you have a written record, that can actually help show what kind of productivity your land has to a potential financier. There's also a pretty cool tech idea that's out in the literature now, which is that smartphone use can be used as a good source of collateral. So if people know where and how you've been using your smartphone, that can actually be used as collateral on loans, and is indicative of how good people are at paying back loans. So it can be used as essentially a credit scoring mechanism. However, in particularly that case, but also in the warehouse receipts case, you have to be careful that these don't discriminate against women, which can be in part because women may be less likely in rural areas to have access to cell phones, or even or cell phones in general, and smartphones in particular. Okay, so what do I want you to take away from my talk? One is this: that more agricultural finance appears necessary to attaining crucial global agricultural goals in the next 10 to 15 years. This is no different whether we live in a COVID world or a no COVID world. Even if we were back in the world before I started living in my basement, I don't live in my basement, but I spend more time in my basement now. It doesn't matter. We still need more finance in agriculture. The conditions for finance are changing. Transaction costs are lower. There are new forms of lending that are becoming possible. Improved monitoring is possible through the fact that people have computers, little computers in their pockets everywhere. But those require the right types of financial regulations, so those need to be rethought and thought more carefully. The value add is crucial to finance entering a relationship with farmers and potentially processors. Else there's little incentive to obtain finance from the farmer perspective or provide finance from the bank perspective. And this is actually, I want you to take away that this is a real challenge in something like conservation agriculture, where yields can suffer in the first few years. So there, maybe private finance isn't the right type of finance. Maybe we have to think about public finance and giving incentives to people to take up those types of techniques publicly. And agricultural value chain finance is a potential innovation that can flourish, but under certain conditions, specific conditions, and we need to be careful in designing these projects as to not disadvantage women and minorities. And that's it. Thanks so much, Rod, and I'm curious to hear questions.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. That was a really helpful and interesting presentation, because I think finance is obviously, as you said, it's such a critical part of value chain research and development. But often there's either finance work that's going on in some areas and value chain work, and bringing them together with the knowledge and the specialists, the people that work in the area is really important. Look, we have a couple of questions, and which I'll go through, and I've got some other questions that I'm curious about myself. So let's start. Well, let's start with some of the ones that have come through. And please, people, if you want to follow up on a question or answer a new one, love to hear from you in the messaging. So there's a question here, the first one, and I think this goes back right to the beginning of your presentation. Yeah. So you have to dig through this. When you were talking about challenges of smallholders in finance, and I think you made a comment about the lack of observability of effort of smallholder farmers from from a financial lending institution. And the question is,
right.
yeah, the question is, why would the level of effort or the observability of effort from farmers be irrelevant to a bank as long as the loan is paid back? So from a bank's perspective,
if the loan is paid back, it's not an issue at all. I realized as I was saying it, in fact, that I'm basically regurgitating a 40-year-old article by Mark Rosenzweig and the late Hans Binswanger, which is about the behavioral and material determinants of agriculture, and to some extent the issue is that one, from a banking perspective, what you would worry about if a loan wasn't paid back, particularly an uncollateralized loan, was that the farmer was behaving in the best interest of both the farmer and the bank to try to actually actually produce. So there's a role for insurance to solve the problem, and in a sense, it goes back to like an old idea that's clearly wrong, that farmers are lazy, can be lazy if they're not, if their incentives aren't aligned. That's probably true for everybody in a way.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's definitely. I think that's the worry is that if you can't monitor the loan, people might not work in the best interest of the bank, and that's what I mean by the level of effort.
Yeah. And I think you're also mentioning that because smallholder farmers, there's so many smallholder farmers operating very small parcels of land.
Exactly.
It's impossible for a financing
exactly.
So from that perspective, it's difficult to observe what they're doing, what they're producing, as they would one large borrower with one large investment.
Yep. You bet.
Okay, so there's a follow-up question. Well, another question here, again, back towards the beginning. And the question is, what do you mean by smallholders at this stage? Is it global? Example, smallholders from Myanmar are much less, have much less land than from Australia, for example.
I'm definitely, so that's a great question. The article I quoted actually defines smallholders as anyone with less than 2 hectares of land. That would not be a smallholder in Australia or the United States for that matter. Brazil has a very formal definition, but that is an issue that we do think about. But here it's less than 2 hectares.
And so it's a developing country context, I guess, in the use of the term smallholders. Yeah. There's an interesting question here, and it gets around. Sorry, let me just flick up from James. What tends to yield better results for the farmer as a source of finance? Finance from processor off-taker, a la value chain financing sources, or direct finance from a bank or an MFI? That's a good question.
Yeah, I don't know the answer.
25 words or less.
I think one of the tricky questions. Let me answer this question by not answering it. I'm going to be blunt about it instead of being a politician, though. To be blunt, to not answer it, farmers aren't just linked to processors or off takers, but they could get finance from banks or MFIs or from money lenders in villages. And what we really want to make sure is that farmers have access. So to economists, what we'd like to see is for farmers to have access to loans at market interest rates. And we ideally we don't want to see those interest rates get driven below the market interest rate, whatever that market interest rate is, because if that happens, then people are going to start, again, in theory, making bad decisions with that money. And if market rates if interest rates are artificially set too low, then banks are going to find ways around lending enough money for the sector. And so I think that's the issue you see in particular in some of these monopolist state-owned banks, Agribank in Vietnam, BRI in Indonesia, where you end up with just not enough finance, essentially. So in a sense, what you worry about is what you want to make sure is that those loans are better for farmers than that really third best, which is the loans from money lenders. And I don't think it matters which one yields better. Although I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, I'm gonna expand on this one, and because I think you'll have some thoughts on this. I mean, a lot of, so firstly on the informal finance, you mentioned it a couple of times, and you mentioned money lenders. I mean, in your view, how important is informal finance? And often people talk with aghast about interest rates. You know, the real interest rate of finance from a money lender or a trader. But often smallholders don't think of the interest rate often as the issue. It's more other parts of the loan. So just I'd be interested in your thoughts on the role of informal finance and importance or not, firstly, and then we can.
Yeah, so I mean, it certainly is important. What I've noticed from kind of aggregating studies on, we often ask, you know, do you have any access to credit? And a lot of farmers just don't. So they're not filling the gap as well as they maybe could, the money lenders. And my sense is that they definitely provide a service for people who need money and have access to them, but they're not providing as much access as, per se, if all these people actually had were banked and had access to more formal sources of funding.
And you mentioned like subsidized, you know, when there's subsidies on interest rates, and many, like we know in Vietnam here and in Indonesia, the government through the Social Policy Bank, you know, essentially subsidized interest rates for the poor by very low interest rates, which you would think are highly acceptable. So how when you're trying to develop agricultural value chain financing at market rates, because there's essentially a distort. Well, you can call it a distortion.
There is a distortion.
In the capital market.
So that's going to create a distortion in the capital market. That's actually going to drive up the interest rate, at least in theory, for market rate loans, and is going to drive down the supply. So it's going to actually make agricultural value chain finance harder to do.
And I guess it's a difficult policy question, because at least at the national government level,
because
these are really important for assistance to the poor, and yet their impacts might be counterintuitive.
To me, a better way to do assistance to the poor would be to give them cash transfers and to not mess. Essentially, what you're doing is mixing up assistance to the poor with the financial sector, instead of disaggregating them, letting the financial sector work like the financial sector, and providing social protection to people who need social protection. But I mean, I've actually started those conversations with people in Vietnam, trying to understand why there isn't so much, why they're doing social protection through loans, which doesn't seem a way to do social protection.
And look,
but I haven't
really
now with COVID. So
sure. But this is a really important and interesting area of the whole value chain financing that comes back to the national policy, and so I think it's a really interesting.
It's really important.
So we like to keep updated on that going forward. So there's another question here from Tani. There have been a lot of studies in financing needs for the agri sector. Why do you think that it hasn't been substantially resolved to date?
Yeah, I mean, essentially that's the reason we never resolve it is the lack of collateral and the transaction costs, and that's why that the need is still there. I think in a more aggregate level, though, one of the things that I have found so illuminating from doing the work in Myanmar, or being really a consumer of the work in Myanmar, is that you were talking a lot about the disconnect between the finance people and the agricultural people. I think that's creating a lot of that graph that I showed at the very beginning of the talk. Just because if there's no understanding of agriculture by the finance people, they're going to go to the next factory, or they just finance big farms, and they just don't see those opportunities out there to make money in smaller or more innovative ways
Yeah.
through agriculture. So I think that's, to me, that's been the big illuminating thing that I've learned from one of the big things that I've learned from this project is that you get this real disconnect between agriculture and finance people, and then there are a few people in that agricultural finance space trying to make points like I'm trying to make.
Yeah.
Here.
And you made the point about, you know, technology providing a huge set of opportunities to reduce transaction costs. What's your view? I mean, there seems to be so many, you know, tech apps and things being developed. It seems to be very fragmented. What's
Yes,
your
it
view
is.
in the next 5 to 10, 15 years about, you know, are there going to be barriers? What are the barriers that smallholders will be able to access these tools and apps and actually for them to help? Because they seem to have a real potential, but, you know, what's the
Yeah.
reality in your view in the next 5 or 10 years?
My view is that we're going to see a lot, especially in Southeast Asia, we're going to see a lot of disruption. One thing that I didn't cover is venture capital, which is a whole other world. But they blow kind of the assumptions that you and I make as economists out of the water, because what a venture capitalist looks like is I've got $1 billion that I've aggregated from people, and I'm going to throw it at 5 $200 million projects, and if one of those makes me the 1.2 billion, I'm good to go, right?
Yep.
And so they don't worry about wasting 800 million of those dollars, and and so I think one of the reasons we see the fragmentation is we see a lot of venture capital in some of the more innovative spaces that we're talking about, coming in and saying, oh, I'm going to try, you know, I'm going to try this, I'm going to try that, and trying to make some money on those ideas, and then or they build like a platform like Grab and say, okay, well, now we're losing money on Grab, how can we actually make some, you know, are there some products here that we can actually make money on? And so what we're going to see is some things just go away. We're going to see some things really thrive, and then we're going to see some things not work at all. I'm thinking of, in particular, like a lot of what these guys are doing are creating platforms that can that essentially make transactions happen, and that's sort of an interesting, you know, wrinkle, at least in Indonesia. I mean, I've talked to some guys who are making transactions happen within value chains that wouldn't have happened before. But then, you know, I'm thinking of one specific platform, and I don't remember the name, but I talked to the entrepreneur, and he said, yeah, you know, I have plenty of money now. I just need to increase my revenue by 400%, and then I'll be making profits.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. That's something, right? And it sort of blew my mind as an economist, because I kind of think, oh, well, if everything's profitable, people will do it. But this is like, no, we're going to do things for a long time before they're profitable to make them work.
Yeah.
But to the extent that that's going to be in this space, that's really exciting, right? Because that's going to lead to a bunch of opportunities, and so I would think that there's going to be more disruption in 5 to 10 years, and I think there'll be some product that's out there that's really good in 5 to 10 years for farmers, but I don't know what it looks like and how. Or I think the potential is there. I just don't know what it's going to look like yet.
Yeah. It seems such a busy, crowded space, and it's not clear. Yeah. I mean, there seems to be duplication, but it'll take some time to work itself out, I think. I think this is a comment, I think, from Ricardo from SEAT, from the Alliance. Lack of finance by smallholders is also linked to risk aversion, right? I might be a smallholder who has 1 hectare of land. I need finance, but I just do not want to take the risk. Only assets that I will probably leave to assets that I will probably leave to my children. Then I might need to finance to improve my production system, but I won't do it.
Right. So that's exactly what I was talking about with lack of collateral towards the end of the talk. Farmers do lack collateral, and they don't want to give up they often can't even put up their land for collateral because it doesn't work as collateral. So as a result, what they do is they that's what I mean by warehouse receipts replacing that. So if you're selling, you know, 10 bags of maize to the same warehouse every year for 3-4 years, now you can take those that system, particularly if it goes online, can become a replacement for other collateral, and that shows that you have, you know, a certain productivity to your land that you can that can be used as a collateral in a loan.
Yeah. And you talked about the larger capital investments that are being more difficult to provide loan products for, and you mentioned livestock and tree crops, longer term community forestry. Is there examples where you can collateralize, say, stands of timber or, you know, community plantation or livestock, or fruit trees, for example? Has there been ways of looking at collateralizing that?
I mean, actually, that's an interesting. Like, I think, I mean, I know livestock have been collateralized. Stocks of trees should certainly be plausible. I don't know of any examples in the literature right off the top of my head. A lot of the examples of value chain finance actually that have worked are in milk, and those there's quite a lot of successful examples. But that has a lot to do with like getting milk into the European market from Eastern Europe, actually.
Yeah. No, the tree example was something that I'd thought of, you know, for some time. When you drive around, you see all the stands of community forestry that are an asset in the ground. But anyway, I think it's something to talk more about. We have a question from Bang Bang. Hello, Bang Bang from Ecoceps. It's great to have it online. So I think this is a comment, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. First comment is, fintech is not popular with smallholders. Cooperatives are preferred.
So I mean, cooperatives can also provide finance to farmers. The question is whether the cooperatives have that money to lend or not. So that's a potential. I'm maybe not sold on the idea that fintech, it might not be popular now with smallholders, but it certainly may be in 5 years or so, depending upon who gets into those markets.
I guess this comes down to those range of barriers, you know, of these products to smallholders, and you see some fintech-like products, apps that people adopt, smallholder farmers and urban people, very, very quickly when they offer very good services like Grab delivery and Grab and those type of things. So but again, I think there's this, you know, some of these products will perhaps survive and work well, and others will fall by.
Right. It's unclear what's going to survive is a big issue.
Exactly. So here's another question from Tani. What specific interventions or programs that need to be implemented to make huge progress towards resolving financing problems by both the farmers/borrowers and finance providers such as banks and formal financing institutions? That is a big question, Alan.
That's a big question. Yeah. I mean, so to me, what I think the way that I think we're going to keep muddling through this problem is to try to get those two sectors that are not seeing one another to try to talk a bit more to one another, so that understanding what it is about, continue to try to understand what it is about finance that the agriculturalists don't understand, or the smallholders, what aspects of finance smallholders need, and vice versa. Conversely, what aspects, what financial opportunities are being missed in agriculture by the finance folks, and if we can make those things come together, I think we can, and make sure that regulations are good. We can make sure that those things happen. One thing that you know came out of we're still working on finalizing the report, but one thing that really came out in Indonesia is that a lot of the, in thinking about what's going on in Indonesia, a lot of the regulations are good actually, but they're not being used as much as they maybe could be. So they have like really great warehouse receipts laws on the, or regulations on the books, but there aren't a lot of warehouses. So like that's an interesting question, right? Like that's I guess a researchable, descriptive question that I don't know the answer.
Yeah. Look, just we still got questions coming in, so we'll try and get through these. So just a reminder to everyone as they kind of log off, please, I've just shared the link to the feedback form. Please just give us very quick feedback. Just click the link and it'll take you a minute, so that'd be great. Just a comment and a question from Alan from Biodiversity Seattle Alliance. Hi Alan, thanks for sharing your work. I'd be keen to hear more about your research in Indonesia. This sounds like another webinar, Alan. Understanding the huge regional variations there. What are a few opportunities for value chain financing that benefit smallholders?
So I think there are lots of opportunities in Indonesia. One that I know has been written about by folks at C4, so friends of ours in CGIAR, is actually within oil palm. And they're thinking about it from the sustainability perspective, where Bambang into the next point is saying that oil farmers are a little bigger than the 2 hectares. But leaving that aside, they are producing at about 2 tons per hectare, whereas with new stock, they could produce at 5 tons per hectare. And if you could replace that stock at a reasonable rate, you'd get more productive, and you'd, on the one hand, maybe they argue you'd see less cutting of the rainforest to increase oil palm. I'm not sure that logic completely holds. I'd have to think it through really carefully. I guess if you couldn't get finance to cut the rest of the rainforest, then you'd be okay there. But the idea would be that that would be a place where if you really linked the farmer with the market after the loan came about, then you'd see a real role for agricultural value chain finance there. I think, but in a lot of fruit and vegetable types of markets, and potentially even in cattle fattening in Indonesia, I think is another potential opportunity just thinking kind of quickly off the top of my head.
Yeah, no, just as you were talking there, you remind me about the Sapphire project, and there were some innovative ideas there around value chain finance, particularly around the maize sector, and also bundling technical support through local extension officers in with the millers, the input suppliers, farmers, and extension officers, I think. But I'm not sure what's
they never really got much
No.
off the ground in Safira, but I went out and saw them, their second version of their project in must have been last year, because I haven't been to Indonesia this year. And they're oh boy, I'm blanking right now off the top of my head. I mean, the one that's coming to mind is that Grab was getting into kiosks, which are the input dealers. So they were talking about how they were going to try to support Grab to effectively take a new way of essentially to try to help kiosks become just-in-time dealers a little bit more. So making sure that they had in stock what they were going to use, and that would be a way of using the database kind of that Grab has set up. So they were looking not necessarily at the farmer, the type of I've talked about a very kind of linear farmer processor relationship, but you could go the other way, right? To the input dealer and the input supplier. The input supplier, or kiosk could also be a way of linking finance.
And Bambang makes that second point, which you alluded to, around the oil palm farmers having larger land areas and a more bankable proposition because of their area and the capital investment. And in fact, I mean, oil palm, there's large areas of oil palm that's requiring regeneration and replanting, and this is going to be a real issue for the government.
A big issue. That's right. That's essentially what the paper by the C4 folks talk about.
Yeah, how to finance and get them through that process.
Yep.
It's a big issue. Yeah, James has shared a really interesting link there that people can go and look at, including myself.
To create credit scores. Exactly. That's there are a bunch of those ideas out there right now about how to use mobile data for credit scores, and they work. Like that's what this. There's a paper by Bjorkegren and Grisson showing that they worked in Ecuador, in an example in Ecuador.
Yeah.
So more of those examples showing that they work would be helpful to show banks that, look, you can do it. You know, you can use mobile data as a collateral alternative and as a credit scoring alternative as well.
Yeah, and these solutions fascinate me because it's the ultimate use of technology, and we could probably have another webinar just on these technical kind of innovations. The issue of data privacy and those kind of things also, kind of is an umbrella over this type of thing, isn't it, as well?
Yep.
Okay, so I think this is the final. Oh, this is a comment from Dulce from Asia.
I actually completely agree with you, and I've tried to use as few financial terms as possible in this talk. I hope I did, because I completely 100% agree that financial literacy is a big challenge, and to the extent that that's something that maybe that's something that other than trying to make these linkages, donor communities can work on. Maybe that's an important role. But I agree, like, one of the things that I've found in trying to even just explain these kinds of agricultural value chain finance projects is that, man, it's just a lot of it's complicated, and once you have complicated things, then it's hard to get them across to farm, full stop.
Yeah.
So yeah, or to banks for that matter.
Yeah,
how they're going to actually make the money. That matters.
Yeah, and when it comes to financing or even adoption of something like a simple technology like hybrid seed, that's quite an relatively easy thing to finance and to gain adoption. But some of these things, as you say, they are more complicated, and so it needs simple solutions, which are not always easy to find.